The dare was made on a cold Tuesday evening in the Rusted Spur Saloon, shouted loud enough that 12 men heard it over the crack of a billiard ball, and the scrape of boot heels on sawdust floor. And Levi Yates, 26 years old, broad-shouldered and dangerously short on the kind of pride that should have kept his mouth shut, accepted it without blinking. The saloon sat at the edge of Callow's Reach, a border town that had grown up like a weed between the Thornwood to the east and the wide, wind-bitten Greymark Plains to the west. It was the kind of town where the church sat across the road from the jail and both buildings saw equal traffic. The men who drank there were trappers and cattle hands, a few settlers in from the outlying homesteads, and a handful of Marshal Court Henley's deputies who took their ease on the nights the marshal didn't need them. They were not soft men, but they were not especially brave either, and when Court Draven, big, loud, and made mean by 3 whiskeys, leaned across the bar and said nobody with a working spine would walk down to the holding pen and look the orc prisoner in the eye, the room laughed. Levi looked up from his cup. "I'll do it," he said. "There's no money in it," Court told him, grinning. "Never said I needed money." "Then you are a damn fool," Court said, and the room agreed, and Levi Yates pushed back his stool and walked out into the cold night air because he had never once in his life been able to leave a dare lying on the floor. The holding pen was behind the marshal's building, a timber and iron cage set against the back wall of the structure, open to the night air except for a sloped tin roof that kept the worst of the rain out. A lantern hung from a hook on the post nearby, burning low, casting orange light across the mud and straw inside. Levi heard her before he saw her, a slow, deliberate breath, like something that had learned to be very still in dangerous places. He came around the corner and stopped. She was sitting with her back against the far wall of the cage, knees drawn up, wrists bound in front of her with a length of chain that was bolted to the post at the center of the pen. She was an orc woman, clearly the deep olive green of her skin, the strong, angular jaw, the lower canines that rose slightly past her lip, but what struck Levi first was not what she was. It was the way she looked at him. Her eyes were dark amber, almost brown, and they were calm with the particular calmness of someone who has decided to stop fearing the thing that is going to hurt them. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24 by his reckoning, and she was wearing a fitted leather bodice over a laced undershirt of rough cream-colored linen, the bodice shaped close to her strong frame, cinched with a wide belt of brown hide, her arms bare below the shoulder, the cuffs of her linen shirt pushed back. Her trousers were dark, tucked into knee-high moccasin boots that had seen a great deal of trail. Her dark hair was pulled back in a knot at the base of her neck, a few strands falling loose around her face. There was a cut above her left brow, crusted and dried, and a bruise along her jaw, and she was watching Levi with the same flat, measuring look she might have given a wolf that had wandered too close. "You are not a deputy," she said. Her voice was low and careful, her common-speak precise. "No," Levi agreed. He stood at the door of the cage. "I'm just a man who made a stupid bet." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then you have seen me," she said. "Go collect your money." There wasn't any money. "Then you are stupid for free," she said, and turned her face away. Levi stood there anyway. He looked at the chain on her wrists, at the mud she was sitting in, at the bruise on her jaw. He looked at the lantern burning down to almost nothing. He stood there while the wind came off the Greymark and made the lantern rock on its hook, and he thought about what a man actually is when you take away the audience of 12 people in a saloon. He went back inside the marshal's building. Court Henley was at his desk, working through a ledger with a stub of pencil, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow. He was a lean man in his 50s, gray at the temples, not unkind. "What's the charge against the orc woman in the pen?" Levi asked. Henley looked up slowly. "Who wants to know?" "I do. She was caught crossing the Greymark boundary, 4 miles inside the settled line. No papers, no travel permit, no clan escort. That's a holding offense under the Border Act." "Is there a trial date?" Henley set his pencil down. "Yates, why are you asking about the orc prisoner?" "Because I want to know if there's a trial date." No date. The circuit judge comes through in 3 months. She sits until then. 3 months, Levi said. He thought about the open cage and the mud and the temperature dropping outside. In that pen. She is not your problem, Henley said, picking his pencil back up. Levi was quiet for a moment. What if someone stood surety for her? The marshal stopped writing. He looked at Levi with an expression that fell somewhere between irritation and genuine curiosity. Who in their right mind would stand surety for an orc border crosser in this town? I might, Levi said. The room was very quiet. The fire in the small iron stove ticked. You have the homestead out on the West Fork, Henley said slowly. 40 acres. You're trying to build that place up. That's right. You'd put your deed on the line as surety. If that's what it takes. Henley leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes under his glasses. Yates, if she runs, I take your land. She won't run. You don't know a thing about her. I know she has been sitting in mud on a cold night for what looks like 3 days at least, and I know her wrists are going to start bleeding through that chain if nobody checks them. I know that much. The marshal looked at him for a very long time. Then he opened his desk drawer and produced a form, and he began to fill it out, and he said, God help you, in a voice that suggested he meant it as a genuine prayer rather than a figure of speech. Her name, written in Henley's ledger, was Zarkha Mudborn. She belonged to the Mudborn clan of the northern reaches. Henley told him, one of the old bloodlines, not a raiding clan but a traveling one, traders and scouts, known to the border stations as generally lawful. She had been separated from her traveling group in a river crossing 4 days ago, or so she had told the deputies when they brought her in. Whether they believed her was another matter. Levi drove the wagon back to the pen. He told Zarkha what he had arranged. She listened without expression, sitting in the mud, the chain slack across her wrists, the orange lantern light making her amber eyes look like copper coins in the dark. You are posting your land as surety, she said. Yes. Why? He thought about it honestly for a moment. Because the dare was stupid and it got me thinking, and once I start thinking I can't generally stop until I've done something about whatever I was thinking about. She studied him. That is an unsatisfying answer. It's the true one. She was quiet for another moment. If I run, you lose your land. Then don't run. I am orc, she said flatly. I could overpower you before you reached your knife. Probably, he agreed. But you won't, because if you do, every deputy in this county will be on you before dawn, and that helps neither of us. Something moved across her face then, something small and complicated that might have been the beginning of a grudging respect, and she held out her chained wrists, and Levi called for Henley's deputy to come with the key. The drive back to the West Fork homestead took 40 minutes by wagon on the dirt road that wound out from Callow's Reach through the low scrub grass of the prairie's edge, and into the first belt of trees that stood between the open plains and the thornwood foothills. Zarkha sat in the wagon bed with her back to the sideboards, watching the town lights disappear behind them without saying anything. Levi drove and did not press her for conversation, and the night was very clear, and the stars over the Greymark were extraordinarily bright in the way that cold, dry nights make everything sharp and close. How did you lose your group? He asked after a while. She waited long enough that he thought she might not answer. The Hollow Creek crossing. The water was higher than the scouts said. My horse went under. By the time I made the far bank, the others were already past the ridge. I went the wrong direction looking for them. She paused. The deputies found me before I found them. Are they safe, your group? They should be. They would have crossed at the next station up. Then they are looking for you. Perhaps. She did not sound certain of it, and the way she said it, the slight flattening of the word, told Levi that the relationship between herself and her traveling companions was not entirely simple. The homestead came into view as they crested the last shallow rise. A log house, square and solid, built by Levi's own hands over the better part of 2 years. There was a barn to the left, a smokehouse, a root cellar with a timber door set flat against the slope of the ground. A split-rail fence ran around the yard, and beyond the fence the winter wheat fields lay dark and dormant under the stars. It was not a grand place. But it was well made, and it was his, and Levi felt the usual small, private satisfaction of coming home to something you had built. He showed her the house. There was a main room with a hearth, a table and 2 chairs, a workbench along one wall where his tools were laid out in the particular organized way of a man who lives alone and knows exactly where everything is. A second, smaller room off the main one had been meant as a storage room, but had a cot against the wall and a shelf above it. He made a fire in the hearth and put water on to heat and found a clean cloth and the tin of salve he kept for cuts and blisters. "Sit," he said, nodding at the chair nearest the fire. She sat slowly, like she was making a decision about trusting gravity. She watched him get the cloth wet in the heated water, wring it out, and crouch in front of her with the salve tin balanced on his knee. "The wrists," he said. She held them out. The chain was gone, but the marks were there, deep red impressions, one of them worn to a thin crack of raw skin where the iron had caught a bone wrong. He cleaned them with the hot cloth carefully, feeling her stillness as he worked, and then applied the salve. She did not flinch, but her jaw was tight. "The one on your brow too," he said. She moved her head slightly, more a concession than a nod. He cleaned that too, and it was less serious than it had looked in the poor light of the pen, a shallow cut that had already begun to close. When he was done, he set the tin on the table and stood. "There is a cot in that room," he said. "It is yours for as long as you are here. I will not come in without knocking." She looked at him steadily. "You are trusting me not to kill you in your sleep." "I am," he said. "Am I wrong to?" The fire cracked between them. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, very slowly, she said, "No, you are not wrong." He nodded and said good night, and went to his own bed, and lay on his back in the dark, listening to the wind in the eaves and thinking about the 40 acres that were now tied to this stranger's choices, and about the look in her amber eyes when she'd said he was not wrong, and somewhere in that tangle of thoughts he fell asleep. The first week was careful and formal. Zarkha kept to herself. She rose before Levi in the mornings, and by the time he came out she had already banked the fire and was sitting at the table with a cup of water, watching the frost on the window with the contemplative expression of someone accustomed to early mornings in cold places. She did not ask for anything. She ate what he put on the table without complaint and without much comment, and she spent the days outside on the property walking the fence lines, sitting by the creek that cut along the south edge of the wheat fields, watching the Thornwood Hills in the way of someone who is always calculating distance and direction. "You can go back into town if you need anything," Levi told her on the 3rd day. "I have no money," she said. "I have a small account at Pell's Trading Post. They know me. If you need anything, tell Pell it's on my account." She looked at him with the flat, level, measuring look that he was beginning to recognize as her particular form of suspicion. "You are extending your credit to an orc woman you do not know. I am extending it to someone who is living on my property and cannot easily go anywhere else." He paused. "I am not trying to make you feel like a debt." She was quiet. Then, "I understand the distinction." She did not go to town that week, but she did go the week after, and she came back without incident, and with a small bundle of dried herbs she had traded for at Pell's by offering to unload a crate from a delivery wagon. She put the herbs in the iron pot on the hearth without asking and made a broth that evening that was the best thing Levi had eaten in 4 months, and he told her so, and she looked at the table instead of at him, but the line of her mouth was slightly different than it usually was, softer at the corner, just barely. The days began to settle into a pattern. Levi worked the homestead, splitting firewood, mending fence, checking the root cellar stock, making the small 100 repairs that a 40-acre property requires in the dead of winter. Zarkha began to help without being asked, first in small ways, carrying the other end of a split rail, steadying the post while he drove it, and then in larger ones. She was strong. Not dramatically, not performatively, but with the straightforward strength of someone who had spent her whole life working in hard country, and Levi found himself adjusting the way he worked to include her in it naturally, handing her the other end of the 2-man saw without a word, and she took it without a word, and they worked. He began to learn things about her. She was from the northern foothills of the Mudborn Range, where her clan ran a regular trade route between the Orc Highland settlements and the mixed-race market towns to the south. She had been on this particular journey as a route scout, sent ahead of the main trading party to assess conditions and find favorable crossing points. She was one of 3 such scouts in her clan, and she was the youngest and the best, or so she said, and she said it without particular vanity, just as a statement of fact. She had been doing it since she was 19. She was 23 now. 4 years of route scouting, Levi said. They were at the woodpile, him splitting, her stacking. That is hard work. It is work I chose, she said. She set a piece of split wood neatly in the growing stack. I like movement. And yet you are stuck here. For now, she looked at him. 3 months, you said. 3 months until the circuit judge, he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about the surety, about why you did it. I told you why. You told me something, she said. I am not sure you told me all of it. He brought the axe down on a log and the 2 halves flew apart. What do you think the rest is? She studied him with the amber eyes. I think you are a man who does not like injustice, she said slowly. I think it bothers you the way a stone in a boot bothers you, a constant, small, undeniable thing. And I think you saw something in that pen that you could not walk away from without it bothering you for the rest of your life. Levi looked at her. The wind moved through the bare trees along the fence line. That, he said, is a very accurate accounting. I am good at reading terrain, she said simply, and picked up another piece of wood. There came a morning in late January when Levi rode into Callow's Reach for supplies and came back to find 3 men on his property. He saw them from the road, 3 horses tied to his fence post, 3 figures in the yard. He drove the wagon hard the last quarter mile and came in through the gate to find Zarkha standing in the center of the yard with her chin up and her arms at her sides, the absolute stillness about her of someone who will not retreat, facing Court Draven and 2 of his cattle-hand friends. Court was red in the face and speaking loud, and his 2 friends were behind him with the loose, easy stance of men who expected things to go their way. Levi pulled the wagon to a stop, jumped down, and crossed the yard at a pace that was not a run but was close to one. What is happening here? He said. Not a question. Court turned. He had whiskey on him even at this hour. Yates. I came to see if you'd lost your mind. You've got an orc living in your house. She is living on my property as a legal surety, Levi said. Marshal Henley's paperwork, you are welcome to go read it. I don't care about paperwork, Court said. She is orc. She does not belong in a human house. You are going to bring trouble down on this whole end of the valley. She has brought no trouble, Levi said. You have brought trouble. You are on my land without an invitation, and I am asking you to leave it. Court looked at him, then at Zarkha, then back at Levi. His 2 friends had shifted slightly, the way men do when they are deciding whether a situation is going to become physical. You are making a mistake, Court said. That would be mine to make, Levi said. He said it quietly, and he did not move from where he was standing directly between Court and Zarkha. And after a long moment of Court breathing hard and the 2 friends exchanging a look that clearly concluded that Yates was serious and not easily moved, Court turned and walked to his horse, and his friends followed, and they rode out through the gate without another word. Levi stood in the yard until they were past the rise and out of sight. Then he turned around. Zarkha was looking at him. Her chin was still up, her arms still at her sides, and her amber eyes were doing something complicated that he had not seen from her before. You stood between me and them, she said. Yes. You did not have to do that. I did, he said simply. She looked at him for another moment, and then she walked back to the house, and Levi followed, and neither of them said anything more about it, but something had changed. Something small and significant, like a seam in the earth that has not quite finished settling. February came in bitter, with a cold that crept under the door and sat in the corners of the rooms like a living thing. The homestead's woodpile became a matter of genuine concern, and Levi spent 3 days with a crosscut saw in the thornwood, taking down dead timber and dragging it back in the wagon. Zarkha came with him all 3 days without being asked, and they worked in the gray winter light of the forest, the sound of the saw ripping through the silence, their breath coming in white clouds. And on the second day she brought a small wrapped package from her belt pouch and offered him a square of something dark and dense. And he took it and ate it, and it was intensely good dried berries pressed into rendered fat and sweetened with something smoky he could not identify. Clan-traveling food, she said, eating her own piece with the matter-of-fact appreciation of someone who values a thing for exactly what it is. We make it in late fall when the berries are in. What's the smoky taste? Rendered bone marrow and a bark from the high pines. The bark has a name in Orcish that does not translate. Tell me it in Orcish anyway, she told him. He tried to repeat it and produce something so mangled that she laughed. And it was the first time he had heard her laugh, sudden and brief and genuine, a low sound with real warmth in it, and it went through him like the first warm day after a long winter. "Close," she said, which was clearly a lie, but a kind one. He tried again. "Closer." She shook her head, smiling now with the corner of her mouth, and took the saw back up, and they worked, and the forest was quiet around them except for the ripping of the blade and the distant call of a winter crow. That night the temperature dropped sharply. Levi put the spare quilt out for Zarkha and told her to double it up if she needed to, and he fed the hearth until the main room was holding its heat, and he went to bed. Sometime in the deep of the night he heard her door open and her footsteps, and then she was knocking softly on his doorframe. "The fire has gone low," she said. She was silhouetted in the doorframe, a blanket pulled around her shoulders. "I do not know where you keep the extra wood inside." "Behind the bench," he said, getting up. "I'll tend it." "I can tend it," she said. "You do not need to get up." "I'm up." They tended the fire together in the dark, Levi feeding the logs, Zarkha crouching to blow on the coals, and the fire came back, and its light painted them both warm orange. She was close enough that he could see the particular way the firelight moved across her cheekbones, the strong line of her jaw, the amber of her eyes. She had let her hair down for sleeping, and it fell over one shoulder, very black, very straight. He thought about saying something and did not, and she looked up from the fire and their eyes met, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted a half-second longer than practicality required. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Of course," he said. She went back to her room, and he went back to his bed, and he lay on his back staring at the ceiling beams for a good while before sleep found him again. March brought the first real thaw, and with it, the mud season that Levi had learned to dread, weeks of cold, sucking, wheel-swallowing mud on every road and track in the region, which made supply runs miserable, but had the advantage of keeping unwanted visitors away from the homestead. Court Draven did not come back. The town, however, did not forget, and when Levi went in for supplies he could feel the opinions of the place sitting on him like a coat he had not asked for. He brought Zarkha with him on one of these supply trips in mid-March, because he needed help loading a large order of seed grain, and she had offered. They drove in on the wagon, the mud thick on the wheels, the sky an unsubtle gray, and Callow's Reach did what small border towns do when their opinion is engaged. It watched. People stopped in the street. Conversations paused. Pell's trading post went quiet when they walked in, Levi with his order list, Zarkha at his side in her leather bodice and linen shirt, tall and straight-backed, meeting no one's eyes but yielding to no one's gaze either. Pell himself was a short, practical man who had been running the post for 20 years, and had dealt in everything from beaver pelts to Orc clan trade goods, and had very little ideological investment in much of anything. He looked at Levi and said, "The seed order's ready," and looked at Zarkha and said, "Miss," and went into the back. Levi thought that was about as good as it was going to get in Callow's Reach and was grateful for it. Outside, loading the seed sacks onto the wagon bed, a woman named Dissavain came across the road from the dry goods store and stood at the edge of the street watching. She was the wife of the town selectman, a woman of firm opinions and a loud voice, and she called over to Levi in a tone that carried like a bell. "Yates, how long is that situation at your place going to go on?" Levi lifted a seed sack and settled it in the wagon bed. "Until the circuit judge comes through and settles it properly, Mrs. Vane. And in the meantime you are parading an orc through our town market." Zarkha had gone still beside the wagon, her hands resting on a sack she had just lifted, her jaw set. "I am buying seed grain," Levi said calmly. "The same as every other farmer in the valley who has any sense this time of year. People are talking, Levi. People always are," he said. "That has never once changed the weather or the planting season, so I do not generally spend time on it." He lifted the last sack himself and held his hand out to Zarkha, and after a brief pause she took it and climbed up to the wagon seat, and he climbed up beside her, and he drove them out of Callow's reach under the collective watching of approximately 40 people, his spine straight and his hands easy on the reins, and he did not look back. Halfway back to the homestead on the empty road through the scrub grass, Zarkha said, "You were not embarrassed." "No," he said. "Most men would have been. Most men care too much about what other men think." He was quiet for a moment. "I care what the right people think. You are one of the right people. Vane is not." She looked at him. The scrub grass moved in the early spring wind on either side of the road. "Who are the right people?" she asked, and there was genuine, careful curiosity in her voice. He thought about it. "People who have done something to earn it," he said, "by being honest, by not hurting those who did not deserve it, by standing where they said they would stand." She turned back to face the road, but she was quiet in a different way than her usual quiet, and Levi could tell the difference. April arrived, and with it the planting season, and the homestead became a place of serious, sustained work. The soil had to be turned, the seed lines run, the irrigation channels from the creek cleared of winter debris. It was 12-hour days every day, and Levi ran on early starts and camp coffee and the satisfaction of seeing furrow after furrow come open behind the plow. Zarkha worked alongside him from the first day of planting to the last, and she was as good at it as she was at everything, methodical, tireless, with an instinct for the soil that surprised him. "You grew up farming?" he asked one evening, washing the clay from his hands at the pump outside the barn. "Seasonal," she said, working the pump for him. "Our clan farms in summer when the root is resting, root crops mostly. And a grain sorghum we grow in the highland valleys." She handed him the drying cloth. "Your soil is different, it is heavier here, more clay. Too much clay some years. You need more organic matter worked in, rotted leaves, and where the east field dips you will have standing water in a wet June. You should raise that with fill from the creek bank." He looked at her. "How do you know about the east field dip?" "I walked the property," she said simply. "The first week. I always learn the terrain." He laughed. "I have been farming this land for 2 years and have not fixed that dip." "You have been doing it alone," she said, not unkindly, just as a fact. That was the first time the word alone had been said between them, and it sat in the air for a moment after, and they both noticed it, and then Levi said, "I'll get the fill cart tomorrow," and she said, "I will help." And they went inside for supper, and the word sat in the room with them like a small, warm coal. One evening in late April, after a long day in the fields and supper eaten and the dishes done, they sat at the table with the fire going and the night quiet around the house, and Levi was mending a leather strap from the plow harness, and Zarkha was doing something with a small knife and a piece of hide carving. He saw, very fine and precise, a pattern of interlocking lines that he did not recognize as any symbol he knew. "What is that?" he asked. She held it up. It was a small amulet shape, barely palm-sized, the pattern of lines covering its surface in a way that was clearly intentional and carefully done. "Clan marking," she said. "We make them to carry. This is a new one. The one I had was lost in the river crossing." She looked at it. "It is a Mudborn pattern. It says," she paused, choosing the translation, "it says I am from a place, that I belong to something. You make it yourself. Always, a clan mark made by another hand is not yours, it has to come from you." He watched her work for a moment, the careful strokes of the tiny blade, the absolute steadiness of her hand. "Are you worried about your clan, finding out what happened to you?" She was quiet for a while. "My mother will be worried," she said finally. My brother less so, he will assume I managed. She almost smiled. He is usually right. They sound like good people. They are my people. She paused. That is not always the same as good, but in my family's case it is close enough. He smiled. She caught the smile, and something in her face answered it, quietly, warmly, and she looked back at the carving in her hands. "Tell me about your family," she said. And so he did. The father who had come west with nothing and built a modest piece of land. The mother who had died when Levi was 16 from a fever that moved through the valley that bad winter. The older brother who had taken to the road and was somewhere south now, sending letters twice a year that were always slightly more cheerful than they had any right to be. The decision to take the West Fork land and build on it, to make a thing that was permanently his and no one else's. The 2 years of building and planting and being alone. He talked more than he usually did, and she listened with the quality of attention she gave to everything completely, without distraction, with the occasional precise question that told him she was following every thread. When he was done, she said, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A man who did a thing on a dare," she said, "and no more." "Maybe that is still all I am," he said. She shook her head slowly, studying him with those amber eyes in the firelight. "No," she said. "I do not believe that anymore." The words went through him quietly, and he held them, and the fire burned, and the night was soft outside the windows, and Levi Yates understood with the kind of clarity that comes only a few times in a life that he was in serious trouble in the best possible way. May turned warm fast, the way it sometimes did in this country. A cold spring hammered into warmth over the course of a week, everything suddenly urgent and green, the wheat pushing up in long neat rows across the east and west fields, the creek running high and cold and clear. Levi and Zarkha fell into a rhythm that was comfortable in a way he had not experienced before. Not the comfortable of habit and indifference, but the comfortable of two people who have learned to fit alongside each other like well-matched pieces of timber, their edges complementary rather than competing. She taught him words in Orcish. He was a poor student by her assessment, which she delivered without cruelty, only with amused precision. He taught her the system he used for estimating weather by the western cloud patterns, which was not entirely scientific, but had served him tolerably well for 2 years, and she improved it immediately by adding 3 observations her clan scouts used that she said were more reliable, and then looked at him with a raised eyebrow until he admitted that yes, her additions were more reliable. There was a morning when she braided a length of dried grass into a tight, even rope while they were resting by the creek after a long morning in the fields, her fingers moving with that habitual, instinctive competence, and he watched her hands and then looked away, and then looked back, and she noticed him looking and did not say anything, only continued working. But the line at the corner of her mouth was different again, soft and aware. There was an evening when he came back from the east field fence with a gashed palm from a wire end, and she cleaned it at the table with the same tin of salve, his hand in both of hers, her head bent over the work, and he looked at the top of her dark head and was not sure he had ever seen anything he wanted to look at more. The circuit judge was scheduled for the 2nd week of June. Levi drove Zarkha into Callow's Reach for the hearing on a bright Tuesday morning that was hot already and going to be hotter, and the town gathered as small towns do when there is official proceedings, the kind of loose crowd that forms along the main street with the air of people who have opinions and the time to share them. The hearing was held in front of Marshal Henley's building, which served as the nearest thing to a courthouse the town had. The judge was a stout woman named Mariel, gray and sharp, traveling with a young clerk and apparently with no patience for anything. She reviewed the case in under 10 minutes, confirmed that Zarkha had been held without flight or incident for the full surety period, cross-referenced the Border Act provisions, and declared the holding offense resolved with a fine of 3 silver coins, payable to the Territory Fund. Levi paid the fine from his vest pocket without a word. Judge Merrill told Zarkha she was to register at the border station and obtain a proper travel permit before recrossing the Greymark boundary. She told her this in the same tone she would use for anyone else, and then moved on to the next case on her docket. It was over in 12 minutes. They walked back to the wagon through the main street, and the crowd that had gathered had the slightly deflated air of people who had expected a larger spectacle. Court Draven was somewhere in the group, back near the saloon, and he watched them go without saying anything. At the wagon, Levi lifted the reins and sat for a moment without speaking. "It is over," Zarkha said. She was sitting very straight on the seat beside him. "I am free to go." "Yes," he said, "you are." The word "go" hung in the air between them. They were both looking at the road ahead, the long straight dirt track that led out of Callow's reach and eventually, many miles further, to the Greymark boundary and the North and her clan's trade routes. "Where will you go?" he asked, and he kept his voice level because whatever she said next was her choice and it had to be. She was quiet for what felt like a very long time. "I need to register at the border station," she said finally. "Get my papers. And then I should—" She stopped. Started again. "My clan will still be somewhere on the northern route. I should find them." Another pause. "Tell my mother I am alive." "Of course," he said. He drove her to the border station that afternoon. It was a half-day's ride south and east. At the Greymark crossing, a timber and stone building, where a pair of territory rangers kept record and processed travel permits. They processed Zarkha's permit without notable incident. There was some extra scrutiny, some pointed questions, the kind of bureaucratic reluctance that was the mild end of the prejudice she navigated every day, and Levi answered a few of the questions on her behalf in a tone that discouraged further scrutiny, and the permit was issued. They drove back toward the homestead as the sun went down, painting the Greymark a long amber color that made the grass look like something from a painting of a place more significant than a border territory. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "I will go in the morning," she said as they turned onto the West Fork Road. "The permit is dated. I should not delay." "Of course," he said again. They ate supper that evening in near silence, and it was not the comfortable silence but the one that has a particular weight to it. The weight of things unsaid and time running out. After supper, Zarkha went to the small back room and Levi sat by the fire for a while, and then he banked the fire and went to bed, and he stared at the ceiling for a very long time before he finally said out loud to the ceiling beams, "Tell her, you idiot," and got up. He knocked on her doorframe. There was a brief pause and she said, "Come in," and he opened the door. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, fully dressed, the small Orc clan amulet she had carved hanging at her throat on a cord, her travel pack beside her on the floor already partly assembled. "I want to say something," he said. She looked at him. "You do not have to leave," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Not because of the surety, that is done, but because—" He stopped. He had rehearsed this slightly better in his head. He tried again. "This homestead works better with you on it, and I work better with you on it. And I think you know that, and I think you know that I feel something for you that is considerably beyond what a man feels for a temporary arrangement, and I would rather say it out loud and be wrong about whether you share it than not say it and spend the rest of my life wondering." The room was very quiet. Zarkha looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "You are not wrong." He felt something in his chest unlock. "But," she said carefully, "I need to go back, not forever. But I need to find my mother, tell her I am safe." And she paused and he could see her working through something. "And I need to know that if I come back here I am coming back because I choose it, not because I have nowhere else to go." "I know the difference," he said. "I know that you do," she said. "That is why I am telling you." He stood in the doorway for another moment. "How long?" "A month," she said. "Perhaps 6 weeks. I know the route now." She looked up at him. "I will come back, Levi." It was the first time she had used his name. He nodded and said good night and went back to his room, and this time he slept. She was gone before first light, as she had said. He found her empty room in the gray pre-dawn and a small object on the cot, the Orc clan amulet she had carved through the winter, the one with the Mudborn pattern, the one that said, "I am from a place, that I belong to something." She had left it there. He picked it up and held it, and the carved lines pressed into his palm, and he put it carefully in his vest pocket and went out to start the morning work. The 6 weeks that followed were the longest of Levi Yates' life. He worked. He planted the late-season kitchen garden, fixed the east field drainage problem exactly as Zarkha had suggested, spent a week on the barn roof replacing split shingles, repaired the creekside fence where the spring flood had pushed out 2 posts. He went into town for supplies and bore the combined weight of the town's opinions without particular expression, and came home to the empty homestead. And each evening he sat by the fire and turned the carved amulet in his fingers and thought about Amber Eyes and the sound of her laugh in the winter forest. He wrote a letter to his brother down south and told him about Zarkha. He was honest about it, which he was not always able to be with his brother, and he described her carefully, her steadiness and her competence, the way she thought, the way she worked, the particular quality of her attention. He described the surety and the 6 months and the hearing and the morning she left the amulet on the cot. His brother wrote back in 2 weeks, faster than usual, and said simply, "Brother, any woman who walks through 6 months of your company and still says she will come back is worth waiting for. Do not be an idiot about it." Levi read this several times and agreed with it. On the 43rd day, he was in the east field when he heard a horse on the West Fork Road and looked up. She came in through the gate on a gray horse that had the compact, hardy build of an Ork Highland breed, and she was wearing her leather bodice and linen shirt and her moccasin boots, and her dark hair was loose on her shoulders with the long trail wind in it. And she rode into the yard and stopped and looked at him across the fence with those amber eyes, and he stood there with his hoe in his hand, and his heart doing something absolutely undignified. He walked to the gate and opened it. She rode through and dismounted, and they stood in the yard in the afternoon light, the gray horse nosing at the fence rail, the summer wheat gold in the fields behind him. 6 weeks, she said. 43 days, he corrected. She looked at him. You counted. Every one. She reached into her belt pouch and produced a small wrapped bundle of Ork Trail food, the kind she had given him in the winter forest, dark and dense and sweet. She held it out to him. "My mother sent this," she said. "I told her about you." She paused. "She said to tell you that any man who stands between her daughter and 3 armed men deserves a proper Mudborn welcome gift, and that dried travel cake is the best she can do at this distance, but that the invitation for the real thing stands whenever we come north. We," she had said, "we come north." He took the trail cake, and he looked at her, and then he said, "Zarkha," and she stepped forward, and he put his free hand against her jaw, and she turned her face into his hand. And when he kissed her, it was careful and warm and exactly as right as he had thought it would be. And the summer wheat moved in the field behind them, and the gray horse ignored them completely, and the world kept going exactly as it should. They stood for a while in the yard in the afternoon sun, close and still, and she pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and he put his arms around her, and she smelled of long trail and pine smoke, and that particular cold, clean scent of Ork Highland country that he could not have named, but that he recognized now as something he had been missing without knowing it. "I told my mother I might not come back to the trade route," she said, her voice low against his shoulder. "What did she say?" "She said she had been expecting it since the day I told her the story of the pen and the surety and the Axan wood stack." She paused. "She is perceptive. What did your brother say?" "He said that if you ever hurt me he would cross the whole Greymark to discuss it with you." "That is fair," Levi said. "I thought you would say that." They went inside, and the homestead settled around them in the way that places settle when they are being used properly, and Levi fed the fire and put water on, and Zarkha unpacked her trail pack and put her few things back in the small back room, and then she looked at the room and looked at him from the doorway and said, "This room is very small." "It is," he agreed. "Your room is larger," she said, and there was something in the amber eyes that was deliberate and warm and entirely certain. "Yes," he said. That night the July dark came down over the homestead and the wheat fields and the long Thornwood hills, and the fire burned low in the hearth, and Levi Yates and Zarkha Mudborn lay close in the larger room with the window open to the summer night air. And she traced the line of his jaw with the back of her knuckle, and he held her like she was something he had been looking for a long time and had stopped expecting to find. They came together the way two people come together when they have spent months learning the other person's silences and their working rhythm and the specific way they laugh, slowly and completely, and with the kind of tenderness that is not a lesser thing than passion but a different, richer version of it. The summer night was warm around them, and afterwards she lay with her head on his chest and his arm around her, and the old homestead held them both, and the stars above the graymark were as bright as they had been on the first cold night he had driven her home in the dark, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying. They told the town by simply continuing to live their lives. They went to the trading post together in August, and to the farrier's, and to the mill when the first wheat came off, and Callow's Reach observed and muttered and eventually, in the way of small towns everywhere, began to get used to the fact of them the way it got used to any fact that proved itself persistent and unremarkable in its daily manifestation. There were people who would not serve Zarkha without pointed delay, and there were people who crossed the street when they saw her coming, and there was an afternoon outside the grain merchant's where a group of young men said something that Levi did not catch but Zarkha clearly did, and he turned and looked at the young men with the particular look he had, the quiet one that meant he was not going to shout, but that consequences were absolutely being considered, and the young men found other business to attend to. But there was also Pell at the trading post, who began to set aside items she had mentioned wanting and had her orders ready before she asked. And the blacksmith, a large, taciturn man named Oster, who watched Zarkha help Levi shoe the gray horse one afternoon with professional interest and told her she had good hands and the technique was sound, which from Oster was roughly equivalent to a warm public endorsement. And the widow Hanath, who farmed the next property north and who stopped her cart one day in September to look at the east field and say that whoever had thought to raise that drainage fill had saved the entire west side of the valley a wet harvest. And when Levi told her it had been Zarkha's idea, the widow Hanath nodded and said good thinking and drove on without further commentary. And that was the beginning of a neighborly relationship that would prove valuable in the winters ahead. In October, with the harvest done and stored and the property looking better than it ever had, Levi drove them both out to the far north meadow on a Saturday afternoon, which was the only good flat ground on the property with a clear view of both the thornwood and the graymark, and he sat on the wagon board and said, "I want to ask you something." Zarkha looked at him. She had her knees drawn up on the wagon board, her chin resting on one hand, the amber eyes very direct. "I want to build on," he said, "another room, larger, and eventually a second structure if the wheat holds what I think it'll hold next season." He paused. "What I am actually asking is whether you want to stay permanently. Not as surety, not as anything temporary, permanently." "Are you asking me to stay," she said slowly, "or are you asking me to marry you?" "The second one," he said. "I was working up to it." She was quiet for a moment. The north meadow moved in the October wind, the grass pale gold, the sky a high, clear blue. "In my clan," she said, "a marriage proposal involves the giving of a specific gift, the heart carving. It is made by the one who proposes and given to the one they propose to. It is worn until the answer is given." She reached into her belt pouch and produced a small object and held it out to him. It was a piece of carved wood, small as a playing piece, shaped and detailed with the same interlocking Mudborn lines as the amulet she had carved in winter, but with a second pattern worked into it alongside the first, a different line style, not Mudborn, something else. "I made it 2 weeks ago," she said. "I was trying to decide who was going to ask first." She set it in his hand. "The second pattern I designed myself. It is not a clan pattern. It is a pattern for a person who chose their place rather than being born to it. For you." He held the heart carving in his palm and looked at the two patterns side by side, the Mudborn lines and the lines she had made for him, interlocking, and felt something he could not have found words for and would not have tried to. "Yes," she said before he could say anything. "I will marry you. I decided before you found the words." He laughed, and she smiled the real smile that was not restrained at all, and the North Meadow held them both under the October sky, and it was exactly right. They were married in the spring, in a ceremony that was two ceremonies run back to back, because that was what the situation required, and they both understood it without discussion. The first was a small civil proceeding at Marshal Henley's building, conducted by Judge Merrill on her spring circuit, witnessed by Pell and the widow Hanneth and Oster the blacksmith, who wore his good coat and looked like he had ironed it himself. The second ceremony was held in the North Meadow at sunset, in the Mudborn fashion, with Zarkha's mother and brother present. They had come down from the northern route specifically, making a 2-week crossing with a small party of clan family, and their arrival at the West Fork homestead had been one of the more remarkable mornings of Levi's life. The sound of Ork Highland horses on the road, the figures coming through the gate, and then a tall woman in a green and black clan robe with Zarkha's same jaw and someone else's dark eyes, who looked at Levi for approximately 4 seconds and then said, in common speak with a strong Highland accent, "You are smaller than I expected." And Levi said, "I am exactly the size I am, ma'am." And Zarkha's mother laughed and put both hands on either side of his face, and that was Zarkha Mudborn's version of a welcome, and Levi understood he had passed some fundamental assessment. Zarkha's brother Drak was 20, broad as a barn door, and spent most of his time at the homestead evaluating the property with the same professional terrain assessment eye that Zarkha had, and occasionally making pointed observations about structural improvements, which Levi wrote down, because they were invariably correct. The Mudborn sunset ceremony involved the exchange of the heart carvings, a fire built in the traditional manner, the speaking of a clan blessing by Kara, and the tying of a cord around their joined wrists that Drak knotted with the specific knot that meant, in Orcish tradition, what has been joined is joined. Levi had learned the ritual phrases he needed to say in Orcish, phonetically, over the preceding 2 months, and he said them with terrible pronunciation but absolute sincerity. And Kara wept, and Drak pretended not to, and the North Meadow fire burned against the purple dusk, and Zarkha held Levi's hands across the flame and looked at him with those amber eyes and said his name in the first line of the clan oath, "Levi Yates, before whom I chose my place," and the fire moved between them. And the Greymark lay to the west, and the thornwood to the east, and it was a beginning. The first year of their marriage was hard and good in the way that first years often are, the adjustment of 2 strong people learning to share a small space and a large amount of work without losing themselves. They argued twice, both times about practical matters, once about whether to plant the northwest field with grain or leave it fallow for a season, once about whether to extend credit to a neighbor who had asked to borrow seed and whose reliability was uncertain. Both times the argument was thorough and direct and resolved itself, in Levi's private assessment, by Zarkha being correct, though he made her earn it both times. She traveled once that year, a 3-week trip north to meet her clan's trading party at the Greymark boundary, and bring back a load of Highland goods that Pell had agreed to stock at the post. This had been her idea, and it was a good one. Highland Orc trade goods fetched solid prices in the border territories, and the arrangement gave both Zarkha a connection to her clan roots and Pell a new inventory line. Levi drove her to the boundary and watched her go with the particular mixture of absolute confidence in her and the simple, honest fact that he missed her before she was over the rise. She was back in 22 days. He was splitting wood when she rode in, which he seemed always to be doing when she arrived, and she swung off the horse and crossed the yard and kissed him before he had set the axe down, which was efficient if not elegant. That winter she told him she was pregnant. He was at the table with his account ledger when she said it, and he looked up, and she was leaning against the doorframe to the main room in the firelight, watching him with the calm, direct amber gaze that he had first seen in the light of a tin lantern in an iron pen and had never, not once, gotten over. "How long?" he asked. "8 weeks, maybe 9. She paused. "It is early to tell, but I know." He set down his pencil and came to her, and took her hands, and she let him. And they stood there in the doorway with the fire behind her and the winter outside the windows. And he held her hands and said, "I am so glad," and meant it in a way that was not adequate to the feeling but was the best he had. The pregnancy was uneventful, which Kara told them in her spring letter was because Zarkha was strong and the land was good, and she had been eating well, in that order of relevance, which told Levi a great deal about Zarkha Mudborn's priorities. In the late summer, on a long, warm evening when the second harvest was being counted, and the barn was full, and the homestead smelled of grain and wood smoke and the green smell of the creek in its summer low, their son was born. They named him Taran, Levi's father's name, with a Mudborn suffix that Kara sent them in a letter when Zarkha wrote to announce the pregnancy, a suffix that meant who carries 2 streams in 1 river. Taran Yates Mudborn. He was a half-orc infant, green-skinned like his mother but with his father's coloring in the hair, dark with a slight warmth to it, and with amber eyes that were precisely his mother's in shape, which Levi told Zarkha within the first hour of his life. And she held the baby against her and looked at Levi over his head with the full, unguarded smile that she had learned, slowly and over time, to let him see. The widow Hanneth came by 3 days after the birth with a smoked ham and the information that she had knitted booties, which she produced from her coat pocket with the manner of someone who had privately decided to have an opinion about this family, and it was going to be a favorable one. Drac came down from the north when the message reached the clan route, arriving in a snow flurry in early autumn with a pack full of Highland baby goods, and the look of a man who had ridden fast and was not going to admit it. He held Taran with the careful, overwhelmed expression of an uncle who had not considered how small a new person actually is, and Taran regarded him with the calm, evaluating stare of an infant who has not yet decided what to make of this large green man, and Drac said in Orcish, something that Zarkha translated for Levi as, "He is very small and I am afraid of him." "You will get used to it," Levi said. "He has your nose," Drac told Levi. "Poor child," Zarkha said, and Levi looked at her with an expression of wounded dignity, and she put her face against Taran's head to hide the smile, and Drac laughed, and the log house held them all. The years built. They were not effortless years. There was a winter in Taran's 3rd year when the cold came down like judgment, and they lost a third of the crop to frost, and had to live lean and careful until the spring trade made up the difference. There was a summer when a traveling fever moved through the Callows Reach area and took 2 people from the town and frightened everyone for 3 months. And Zarkha spent 2 weeks sitting up with the widow Hanneth when the old woman fell ill, and Hanneth survived and was quietly grateful in the way of people who do not make a large show of being moved. There was an autumn when 3 riders came from the Territory Authority with a land dispute claim from a speculator who said he had purchased the mineral rights to the West Fork property, and Levi and Zarkha spent 2 months fighting it through the territorial system, with Zarkha doing most of the written correspondence in a common speak that was, by that point, more precise and more eloquent than most people who had grown up speaking it, and the claim was dismissed. And Zarkha put the dismissal letter on the table and said, "Terrain assessment," and Levi kissed her forehead and made her coffee. There was an afternoon when Taran, at 5 years old, went to the Callows Reach market with both of them and a child from one of the settler families said something about his green skin that made Taran go very still with a confusion and hurt that Levi recognized immediately and felt in his own chest. He crouched down to Taran's level and said, "That child does not know you. They said a stupid thing because they do not know you. Your skin is your mother's, and it is beautiful, and it is yours, and no one who does not know you is worth a single morning of your attention." And Taran looked at him with his mother's amber eyes, and then Zarkha was there, her hand on Taran's hair, and she said in Orcish, quietly, the Mudborn phrase that meant you come from strong water, and Taran nodded, and they bought him a bag of honeyed nuts from the market stall, and they drove home through the late afternoon light, Taran asleep against his mother's arm on the wagon board, and Levi drove, and Zarkha rested her head on his shoulder. And the West Fork Road went home between the scrub grass fields. Callow's reach changed the way that places change when the thing they objected to proves itself, year after year, to be not the threat they anticipated. Prejudice is a living thing, and it diminishes in proportion to the specific, personal knowledge that contradicts it, and the Yates Mudborn homestead gave the valley a great deal of specific, personal knowledge over the years. The fact that the West Fork harvest was consistently the best in the valley helped. The fact that Zarkha diagnosed a soil blight on Pell's kitchen garden and told him how to treat it helped. The fact that Levi had stood between her and 3 men on his property and had not moved, and had kept not moving for years, was not lost on anyone. Court Draven moved south in Taran's second year, which improved the atmosphere of the Rusted Spur Saloon considerably. The young men who had said things outside the grain merchants grew up and in some cases became, not friends exactly, but neighbors in the functional sense. People you nodded to at the mill, people whose fence post you helped set when it had heaved in the frost, people who, over a decade and more, stopped seeing a human man and an orc woman and started seeing the Yates Mudborns, who were a known quantity and whose wheat was excellent. Zarkha Mudborn came south again when Taran was 7, this time for a longer stay, and the North Meadow had, by then, a proper summer pavilion built by Levi and Drac over one memorable week in which they communicated largely through gesture and technical vocabulary, and the universal language of 2 competent people working on the same problem. Zarkha sat in the pavilion and told Levi the story of Zarkha as a child, the root scouting instinct that had shown itself at age 12, the first solo night she spent on the Highland Trail as a scout in training, the fierce and characteristic refusal to admit when she was frightened, which Zarkha delivered with the loving exasperation of a mother who has watched this quality be both a gift and a source of significant anxiety for 20 years. Levi sat and listened and treasured every word. She chose well, Zarkha told him at the end of the visit with the directness that was Mudborn standard. I thought it would be a human. I did not know it would be a good one. I am working on it, Levi said. You are working on it, she agreed, which from Zarkha was the highest form of praise. Zarkha continued the trade route consulting through Taran's early years, making 2 or 3 trips annually to the Greymark boundary to meet her clan's traders, eventually formalizing an arrangement that brought Highland Orc goods to 4 trading posts along the border valley, a modest but steady business that was entirely her own, and that she ran with the methodical precision of someone who has been assessing routes her whole life, and understands the geometry of movement and exchange in her bones. On a spring evening when Taran was 9, they sat in the North Meadow Pavilion after supper, Levi with a cup of coffee, Zarkha with the small knife and a new piece of carving work, Taran lying in the grass watching the stars come out with the particular intense concentration of a child who is learning the names of things. The thornwood was dark against the east sky, the Greymark pale and wide to the west, and the homestead's lights were warm behind them. Zarkha looked at Levi across the pavilion table. He had lines at the corners of his eyes now that had not been there before, and she had them too, put there by the sun and the years of work and the laughter that had, over time, become a regular feature of a house that had not had much of it before she arrived. She looked at him with the full amber regard that was entirely unguarded now, that had opened up gradually over years the way good land opens up with proper tending. "Do you remember the night at the pen?" she asked. Not for the first time. It was something they came back to occasionally, the way you come back to the first place on a trail to understand how far you have come. "Every detail," he said. "You said you had never been able to leave a dare lying on the floor." "That is correct," she tilted her head. "I think it was not entirely the dare." "No," he said, "it was not." "What was it?" She asked it genuinely, the way she had asked in those early months, wanting the true answer and nothing else. He looked at her for a moment across the pavilion table, with Taryn's quiet voice listing constellations in the grass below, and the spring night warm around them, and the homestead behind them full of all the years of what they had built. "It was the look in your eyes," he said simply. "You had decided not to be afraid anymore. And I thought that something with that kind of bone-deep courage in it should not be left in a mud pen on a cold night. It was as simple as that." She was quiet. The fire in the pavilion lantern moved. "You spent a year proving you meant it," she said softly. "More than a year," he said. "Yes," she said. "More than a year." She looked at him across the lantern light. "I should tell you something I have never told you directly." "Tell me," he said. "I knew," she said. "I knew at the woodpile in January, the second week. I knew what this was going to be. I had known long enough that by the time you found the words for it in October, I had been waiting for you to say it for 8 months. He stared at her. 8 months. "You are thorough," she said. "That is a quality I love in you. It is also occasionally trying." He laughed, the full, real one, and she smiled the unrestrained smile across the lantern light, and Taryn looked up from the grass and said, "What is funny?" And Zarkha said, "Your father." And Taryn said, "Oh," with the satisfied, unsurprised air of a child who considers this self-evident, and went back to his stars. The second child came 2 years later. A girl with her father's coloring but her mother's build, and both of their stubbornness in full measure from what appeared to be the first hour of her life. They named her Mara, after no one in particular, but with a second name in Orcish that meant one who reads the wind, which Kara suggested from the north by letter, and which suited the infant's apparent habit of staring at the window in all weather with an evaluating expression identical to her mother's. Mara Yates Mudborn. She was everything the name suggested and more. With 2 children and the trade business and the homestead running full, there were years that passed in a blur of work and seasons, and the particular, exhausted happiness of a life that is full to its edges. There were dinners that went long with neighbors who had become, slowly and without fanfare, actual friends. Hanneth, who recovered her full health and became a fixture at their table. Oster and his wife. Eventually even some of the settler families whose children had grown up alongside Taryn and knew him well enough to know that what he was simply Taryn, who was good with horses and better with a knife, and who could find north in any weather because his mother had taught him. Taryn at 12 took his first solo trail overnight on the south edge of the Thornwood, navigating back to the homestead by dawn without error, and Zarkha received him at the gate with the specific Mudborn expression that is not pride stated but pride held with both hands, and Levi stood behind her with his arms crossed and his eyes bright, and Taryn said, "I knew where I was the whole time," which was clearly true, and which Zarkha said was what mattered. There came a summer, in the 11th year of their marriage, when a delegation from the Territory Council made a circuit through the Callows Reach Valley to assess conditions for a new formal trade agreement between the Territory and the Orc Highland clans. Zarkha was asked to serve as a local consultant for the assessment, based on her existing trade arrangement and her known standing in the valley, and she accepted and spent 3 days with the delegation, walking them through the route maps and the market data and the relationship structures she had spent a decade building, and delivered her assessment in a formal report that the delegation's chief recorder told her, privately, was the clearest and most practically useful document they had received in 3 years of consultation. The trade agreement passed the council 6 months later. It was not a large or dramatic thing, not a treaty ending wars or settling ancient grievances, but it was an actual, functional document that reduced the border crossing requirements for Orc trading parties and established formal market access in 5 border towns, and its existence was partly due to the careful, persistent, terrain-reading work of a woman who had started in this valley as a prisoner in a mud pen on a cold night. When the news reached them by courier, Levi was in the field and Zarkha was at the barn with Mara, who was learning to curry the horses with the focused determination of a 5-year-old, who has decided that competence is the point. Zarkha read the letter and then read it again and then went to the barn door and stood there in the afternoon light, the letter in her hand, looking out at the valley. Levi came in from the field and saw her there. "What is it?" he said, coming up beside her. She gave him the letter. He read it and then he looked at her, and she was watching the valley with those amber eyes, and her jaw was set in the way it was when she was processing something large. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "This valley. Everyone who traded fairly. Everyone who made it normal year by year. You did this," he said again, because it was true, and he was not going to let her absorb it into a collective when she had been the specific person who had done the specific work. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Not tears exactly, Zarkha did not default to tears, but something that looked very much like the precondition for them, held with characteristic discipline. "It is a beginning," she said. "It is always a beginning," he said. "That is the point." He put his arm around her. "Things build, people make choices. One person in a cold night does something small, and 30 years later here we are. You are making it about the dare again," she said. "I am making it about everything that came after the dare," he said. She leaned into him, which she had learned to do over the years, to accept the being held as the thing it was rather than the complicated thing it had seemed at first, and he held her there in the barn door with the afternoon light on the valley, and Mara currying the gray horse's successor with great concentration behind them. "Do you have regrets?" she asked. Not with worry, she knew the answer. But she asked it occasionally, the same way they returned to the night of the pen, because the true answers to certain questions are worth repeating. "Not a single one," he said. "Ask me in 20 years. "I will," she said. "And you will say the same." "I know," he said. "That is the best part." They stood together in the light, and the valley ran away to the west toward the Graymark, and the Thornwood stood in the east, and the homestead sat behind them, expanded now, with the larger room and the second structure and the North Meadow Pavilion, a place that had grown to fit the life it held. And Taryn was somewhere on the south fence line doing the afternoon check with the same instinctive root scout habit he had grown into. And Mara was telling the horse something important in a mixture of common speak and Orcish, and the wheat in the east field was the best crop they had ever grown in the raised drainage that Zarkha had proposed in the first winter of their acquaintance. And the territory trade agreement was in Levi's hand and Zarkha's shoulder was under his arm, and the long, hard, remarkable year of the dare, and the surety and the cold pen, and the amulet on the cot, and the spring planting and the North Meadow fire, and the morning she rode back through the gate. All of it, all the years, spread out behind them like a well-surveyed trail, every crossing point marked, every distance known, and the road still going forward as far as either of them could see, and clear. He pressed his lips to her temple, and she turned her head, and they kissed in the barn doorway in the afternoon sun the way they had kissed 100 times by then, which was to say fully and without reservation. And Mara said Papa, Mama in the tone of a 5-year-old who finds adult sentiment manageable only in small doses. And they separated, both of them laughing, and went back to the work of the afternoon. And the work of the afternoon was their life. And their life was good.